Hello everyone. David Hunter here from the Scottish Studies Foundation. Happy New Year and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for your company today for this, the fourth in our 2022-2023 series of Scottish Studies Zoom talks. These talks, which came about as a result of the pandemic, have proved to be extremely popular, and so we plan to continue with them, especially as we are able to engage with people no matter where they live. And today's no exception, as we have people joining us from Canada, Scotland, England, Germany, and Turkey. Our guest speaker today is, of course, Dr. Elspeth Ewan, who joins us from Guelph in Ontario, Canada. Prior to her retirement in 2020, most of Elspeth's career was spent at the Centre for Scottish Studies at the University of Guelph, where she was Professor and University Research Chair in History and Scottish Studies. Her main area of interest has been, and still is, the lives of ordinary medieval Scots. Her PhD from Edinburgh University used both historical and archaeological evidence to study the lives of medieval townspeople and resulted in the book Town Life in 14th Century Scotland. Since then, she has focused on the lives of medieval women and families and has co-edited several essay collections. Over the years, she has been relentless in promoting the study of Scottish women and gender history, working with groups such as Women's History Scotland and supervising many postgraduate theses in that subject. In 2007, she co-edited the Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women, which included the lives of over 1,000 women all the way from the medieval period to 2004. Her recent research has focused on pre-modern gender history, in particular on the gendered nature of defamation and assault in medieval and early modern Scotland. However, she is also interested in the history of masculinity in Scotland and co-edited 9 Centuries of Manhood and Masculinity in Scottish History, which was published in 2018. Since 2020, she has been visiting professor to the Centre for History at the University of the Highlands and Islands. Her talk today is A Brewing Storm, Alewives in 16th Century Inverness. So Elspeth, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, David. I like the term relentless. I think I'm going to keep using that. Some of the women I'm going to talk about today are kind of relentless as well. So I hope that we'll see that. I'm just going to share my screen here, I hope.
Okay, that's fine. And while I was talking there, I'm trying to enter people at the same time. So I got a bit distracted. Okay, let's give it a try now. I think we've got a lot of people signed in now.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So thank you very much to the Scottish Studies Foundation for the invitation to speak today. I think that one good thing that has come out of the pandemic is that we can actually do talks like this and bring in people from all over the world. So I'm delighted to participate in this. I'd also just like to start by thanking Historic Environment Scotland, who have given me permission to use the image that you see in front of you and that was used in the advertising. I actually worked with Historic Environment Scotland to develop this image, so I was kind of the historic consultant on it, and you can see it today at some of the Historic Environment Scotland sites. For example, those of you who are in Edinburgh, you'll see it at Durlton Castle, for example. And it's part of a great initiative by HES to involve more women and also more ordinary people in the interpretation of historic sites, including castle sites, where we tend to focus on the lords and ladies who live there. But there's an awful lot of ordinary people that kept life going there. And so there's I really like this direction they're taking. As some of you may know, Carlaverock Castle, they're really redeveloping the interpretation of Carlaverock Castle and really focusing on, again, the lives of sort of the ordinary people who are around that. So I'm going to talk about some ordinary women today, and these are the alewives, and I feel like I should give a bit of a content warning that there will be some scenes of violence and some strong language. So now, people have been drinking in Scotland for a very long time. This particularly, how shall I put it? This man with his drinking horn is on a Pictish sculptured stone from around 900 to 950. So we have a lot of evidence of just how long drinking goes back. And of course, it goes back much, much further than that. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the role of women in brewing. And then I'm going to talk specifically about a particular brewster by the name of Elspeth Barnet, who lived in the 16th century in Inverness. She had a particularly colorful career and forceful personality, and now I think I want to use that word relentless again. It's resulted in her appearing frequently before the town court, and this made her very visible to historians 500 years later. It's these relentless women that we actually are able to learn something about, because they keep getting in trouble, which means they keep appearing before the courts. And so we can learn something about them. And through Elspeth Barnet, we can get a glimpse of women's lives in 16th century Inverness as they earned their living, married and formed households, and best of all, to my mind, broke the law. So this is Inverness in the 16th century, and I've actually taken this image from a publication called The Records of Inverness, Volume 1, Borough Court Books, 1556 to 1586. And these are records from the court books in the surviving court books in the 16th century. There's only 30 years that actually survive from the 16th century. These are extracts. And so the actual original volumes are in the Highlands Centre archives in Inverness, and you can go and look at them today. And one really nice thing about that is that there's these 19th century transcripts, which makes it a lot easier to read than the 16th century handwriting. So some of the records I'm going to be mentioning today are in the printed volume, but some of them you have to actually go and look at either the originals or the transcripts to see. So I want to start off by taking you back to an event in an alehouse in Inverness, which occurred in July 1566. On the 8th of July, 1566, Janet Sutherland, the wife of Farquhar Macpherson, appeared before the town court with a lamentable tale. She reported that she was sitting peacefully drinking some ale in the house of John Morrison, apparently an alehouse, minding her own business, or as the scribe noted it in the formal language of the law, suspecting no evil but to have lived under God's peace, our sovereign's and yours. Suddenly, Elspeth Barnet, John Morrison's wife, and Marion Ogilvy, the wife of John Abraham, cruelly attacked her, pulling her hair, scratching her face, and insulting her. They called her a common thief's brat, and alleged that her mother was a common thief that broke into barns and lived on whelks out of the sea, i.e. she was poverty-stricken. Janet was pregnant, and she complained that the two women had assaulted her so severely that that night she almost lost her child, as another woman, the wife of Jasper Dempster, could testify. Janet then appointed Jasper Dempster to plead her case for her. Now, he focused on Elspeth Barnet, as she had frequently been in trouble before and been threatened with banishment if she did not mend her ways. He asked the court that they banish her now, or at least provide some remedy. Elspeth Barnet and Marion Ogilvy both personally appeared before the court and denied Janet's charges. After hearing witnesses and ignoring Jasper Dempster's plea, the judges found Elspeth innocent. a fact that her husband, John Morrison, asked to be recorded in writing. Given her reputation, this was probably a very wise move. The court saw Marion as the one to blame, and they convicted her of striking Janet, pulling her hair, and calling her a common thief's brat. But it turns out that there was more to the story. Despite Janet presenting herself as the innocent victim, Marion Ogilvy brought a counterclaim, saying that she, Marion, had gone to her sister's house for some business, apparently another alehouse, and there Janet Sutherland had been drinking. Janet, claimed Marion, insulted her, called her a common whore and a thief, and then struck her with her hands and fists before wounding her in the head with a crook, an iron hook probably hanging over the fire, drawing a great quantity of her blood. More witnesses were heard, and Janet Sutherland was convicted of the assault. So the whole affair is a reminder that women, as well as men, could use violence against each other. We tend to associate women just with words and not with blows, but in fact, they were equally adept at using their fists. As we can see, alehouses could be dangerous places. This was true even for the people who ran them. When another Inverness alewife refused to fill a customer's cup with drink, he struck her on the head with the cup. And there's several examples from other towns as well of cups being used as weapons in alehouse fights. They were even more effective if they were full of ale. So what can we learn about women and their roles in Inverness, particularly in the brewing trade, from records such as these? Well, historians are fortunate, even if Janet Sutherland wasn't, that both Elspeth Barnet and Marion Ogilvy were women brewsters, as they were brewers, or brewsters as they were commonly known, and that brewsters were frequently brought before the court for breaking the law, making them more visible than most other women in towns. We can learn quite a lot about the brewing trade from these records, and even a bit about other alcoholic products in Inverness. Moreover, Elspeth Barnet and Marion Ogilvy were particularly assertive women, imbued with that particular Scottish trait known as smedum, which is forthright assertiveness. I translated it as, although now I'm thinking relentless might be just as good a word. And they were well able to look after their own interests. Each had already been involved in a number of violent incidents before, and we shall see that Inverness women were no shrinking violets. Now, although the scribe records the action as taking place in John Morrison's house, it was almost certainly his wife, Elspeth Barnet, who was the alewife running the establishment, brewing the ale and serving the customers. And this sheds some light on the legal history of husbands and wives at this time. Her role is somewhat obscured in this particular record, being hidden behind that of her husband, but we do know of her as a brewster from other records. Now, brewing was a common women's domestic task. Every adult woman was expected to know how to brew to provide ale for her household. In Scots, the term is brewster, and that's the term that I will use here. Not all brewsters were women, and we will see some male brewsters, but the majority of them were women. I've also used the term alewives somewhat interchangeably with it, just for those that aren't so familiar with the term brewster. Now, as I mentioned, brewing was a skill which was expected of all adult medieval women. Mothers passed on the skill to their daughters when training them to look after their own households once they grew up. Many young women spent their teenage years working as domestic servants, and they would help with brewing in these households as well. In many ways, brewing was very suited to women's lives. For most married women, the majority of their time was spent in child rearing and caring for their household, clothing, feeding, nursing, and otherwise providing for the needs of their family. So any paid work or remunerative work had to be fitted around other domestic responsibilities. The best activities then were the ones which were extensions of the domestic tasks they were carrying out anyway. And brewing and selling ale also benefited from other skills that they developed in caring for the household. For example, as purchasers of foodstuffs for their family, as well as sellers of the products of household workshops, women learned market skills, the best places to sell, fluctuations in supply and demand, who were trustworthy suppliers. They had knowledge of local families' needs from friendships, networks developed with other women in common tasks such as washing, fetching water, or childcare. Now, the entire brewing process, which I don't really have time to go into here, but we could talk about it later in the questions if you like. It takes several days, and the resulting ale, which was brewed without hops, only remained good for a few days. Because of the limitations on preserving ale and the time-consuming process involved in brewing, the best way for urban families to supply themselves with ale was for households to produce it in rotation. So a woman would make or buy more malt than she actually needed for her family, brew it, and then sell the surplus to others. Between brewing, she could use the money she'd made from selling her own ale to purchase ale made by others for her family. Some women, perhaps the majority, brewed occasionally, selling surplus to their neighbors, but there were also others who brewed on a more professional basis, either selling ale to customers who brought their own containers to the house or running ale houses out of their dwellings, people like Elspeth Barnet, and providing seating and perhaps also food. And this was probably the type of establishment in which the assaults on Janet Sutherland and Marion Ogilvy took place. Now, brewing was an option for more than just the elite Burgess families of the towns. The Burgesses were the people that had citizenship of the towns. They were the elite. They made up maybe a third of the population. And among their privileges was the right to brew. But those of lesser status could also obtain a yearly license to brew as unfree brewsters. As a result, brewing was one potentially income-earning activity shared by women from most walks of borough life across the social scale. Although periodically, in periods of scarcity, the town would limit the number of unfree brewsters who could brew in a particular year. In 1561, for example, only 21 unfree brewsters were allowed to brew for the next year. In the 1570s, when more lists were compiled and included both free and unfree brewsters, there were around 60 to 70 names. So the population of Inverness at this time was probably between 1,000 and 2,000. So maybe 500 to 1,000 women. So it's quite a large proportion of the women involved in that. If you didn't have your own brewing cauldrons, you could hire one. For example, in 1571, a woman promised the owner of a cauldron that in return for her use of it, she'd give him a quart of ale for every batch that she made. Another common practice found in other towns as well was for servants to supplement their wages by making a similar arrangement with their employer. And we'll see this possibly with Elspeth Barnet. Now, ale, along with bread, was a staple of the medieval and early modern Scottish urban diet. And because of this, its sale and price were heavily regulated, again, a boon to historians looking back. And in the surviving records of Scottish towns, we actually have more records of those brewing ale than of most other occupations. One of the intriguing things about Inverness is that the town made far more statutes about ale than it did about bread. You can see which of the two is the more important. True to form, Elspeth Barnet actually got into one of the bread statutes as well. The town councils regularly set the price of ale, sometimes distinguishing between stronger and weaker ale or better and poorer ale. The ale conner, possibly one of the most popular of local offices, were appointed yearly to test the quality of the ale, carrying out inspections twice a week or more often if necessary. When someone had ale ready to sell, the conners were summoned to check that the ale was of sufficient quality to be sold at the price, declaring the price once they tasted the ale. So they could say it was worth more or worth less. The image here is not from Scotland, but it shows an alewife with, in this case, what looks like a broom. It often could have been a twig branch of spruce, which indicated that her ale was ready to sell. And there would have been something similar to this in Inverness. The authorities were most concerned that ale be sold at what they thought was a fair price. And in the period we're looking at, this is probably about 8 pence or 10 pence a quart. And it could vary quite a lot. But those who sold above the price were punished. And most of the women who appear in the court records that survive are charged with selling at too high a price rather than selling without a license, although some do appear for this as well. The fact that all the women sell for the same price suggests selling at what the market could bear. So there might have been some cooperative price fixing here. So for example, when the ale price was set at 8 pence, we get lists of women who are selling it at 10 pence. And there's so many women selling at 10 pence that it looks to me like this is the market in action here. Penalties range from a fine and often the confiscation of the ale, which was then distributed to the poor, or even to the loss of the right to brew for the rest of the year. In some towns, breaking the statutes could actually lead to the destruction of the offender's brewing vessels. But although this was threatened at a couple of points in Inverness, it does not appear to have been common. You do find it in other towns, digging out the bottom of the cauldron, as they put it. Now, the authorities were very aware that there might be a certain amount of resistance to the cunners. Indeed, in 1557 in Inverness, we've got an example of a man who followed the ale tasters through the streets, reproving and scolding them that in doing their office, they were common rascals, gluttonous peasants who had no other living but harassing poor folk. It sounds even more vituperative in the original Scots. Now, perhaps seeking to avoid similar challenges, in 1561, the authorities ordered that if anyone, quote, reproved or abused, end quote, the ale tasters, they would lose the right to brew for the rest of the year. So obviously, the alewives, the brewsters, were not taking the regulation if they felt it was unfair, lying down. The authorities also sought to control the production and sale of certain other alcoholic beverages as well. Occasionally, the town regulated or even forbade the use of brogget, which was an ale drink sweetened with honey. When grain supplies were scarce, they wanted that the malt was reserved for actual ale. From the 1560s, at least, there was also beer, probably imported, which was made with hops. So the distinction between ale unhopped and beer hopped. The price of the beer was about 25% higher than the ale brewed in the town. Beer brewing in Scotland doesn't really take off as a homegrown industry until the later part of the 16th century, but there was imported beer coming in this period. The other drink is one that you might be familiar with, which was this distilled spirit aqua vitae, or ushkava, or whiskey, as we tend to call it today. Aqua vitae pots, presumably stills, were valuable inheritance goods, and some lists of inheritance goods include both brewing cauldrons and aqua vitae pots. There were several producers of aqua vitae in the town from at least 1557, and some brewers of ale also made it. Marion Ogilvy, who've already met, was prosecuted along with 5 other women and 1 man for doing so unlawfully in 1577, as this was a privilege reserved to burgesses. In 1579, 16 people were charged, and 12 of them were women. So women's involvement in the whiskey industry goes back a long way. And actually, there's been some interest recently in retrieving the role of women in the whiskey industry. As some of you will know, the first reference to whiskey that we know of, at least so far, is 1494, and refers to a monk of Lindores. By 1505, we know that women were involved in whiskey making in Edinburgh because they were banned from doing so by the barber surgeon craft, which wanted to have a monopoly. And in 1506, we know that whiskey was provided to the Scottish King, James IV, when he made a visit to Inverness. We don't know whether the whiskey was made in the town or possibly in the Highlands, but certainly by 1550s, when the records start, there seems to have been a fairly prominent whiskey making industry. in Inverness. Just to give you an example of prices, so where in 1557 ale was 8 pence a quart of aquavitae would be 20 shillings, so considerably more expensive, but also would go further. Now, rules, of course, were made to be broken. And one good thing for later historians is that the town periodically cracked down on those who were breaking the laws and listed them by name. So in many towns, there are regular lists of brewers who were fined for infractions of the statutes. And as a result of this, we learn the names of many of the women who lived and worked in the town. Now, there are a few issues that come up with these lists, especially with the issue of names. Many of the women that we know of were married, and some are identified by their own name, but there's also many identified only as wife of, and then the husband's name. And we saw that with wife of Jasper Dempster and earlier. This actually reflects the legal fact that married women's husbands were responsible for paying their debts. So what the court was interested in was who was going to pay a fine. Now, some women appear sometimes under their own names and sometimes as wife of, and we get this with both Elspeth Barnet and Marion Ogilvy. What I'm trying to do now is to identify where possible who each wife of was by finding other mentions of them where they appear as their husbands, but both names are given. Now, I already know about Elspeth Barnet and Marion Ogilvy, but there's many more to uncover, including the wife of Jasper Dempster, who I have not been able to find out what her actual name is. I'm still looking for that. A further particular issue in Inverness is the practice of Gaelic patronymics and nicknames, which were used for about a third of the women, or a third of the people in the lists. They did not always remain consistent, and some people might appear in different lists in different ways. There's also the issue of how Gaelic names were rendered by Scots-speaking scribes. And as we will see, this tripped me up a little bit when I was trying to uncover Elspeth Barnet's marital history. Now, what I want to do for the rest of the paper is to look at the brewster Elspeth Barnet. And what might she have looked like? Well, here's one example. This is from the Bannockburn Centre. It's meant to be a 14th century alewife or brewster. There was actually a competition where you could send in your photograph to see if it could be used for the character. I did send in mine, but I don't think that's me as far as I can tell. I didn't win the competition at any rate. So, Elspeth Barnet. Now, she first appears in the records as a servant of one of the prominent burgesses of the town, Thomas Vos. It was very common for women to become domestic servants in their mid-teens to early 20s, saving up money to get married and establish a household of their own. While brewing could be part of their domestic duties, as I mentioned, it was also possible for servants to make extra money from this activity, essentially hiring their employers' brewing equipment and paying them with a share of the ale produced. And presumably this also meant that their employers paid them lower wages because they could make up their wages this way. And we've seen this in Inverness. Now, whether Elspeth was hired by Thomas Vos on these terms or not, she certainly put her brewing skills to good use over the next 2 decades. And we find her in the records purchasing malt, running an alehouse, and frequently appearing in those lists of brewsters contravening the town regulations in the 1570s. It's possible that later in life she tried a change of occupation, as the last time that she appears in records is in 1581, and she's one of the town's 11 licensed cake bakers, another occupation that was dominated by women. And I should point out, when I first saw the records about cake bakers, I sort of had this vision of, fancy iced pastry cakes, and in fact what it means is bakers of oat cakes. Now, Elspeth was likely unmarried when she was a servant, but sometime, probably in the mid-1560s, she married John Morrison. Unfortunately, there were at least two John Morrisons in Inverness, and it can be difficult to distinguish between them. I would really like to believe it was the John Morrison who insulted the new Protestant minister of Inverness in 1561 by accusing him of sleeping with other men's wives, not only in Inverness, but in Orkney and Shetland as well, but may not have been him. One of these John Morrisons was a burgess, whereas Elspeth's husband was an indweller of Inverness, i.e. he wasn't of burgess status. Indwellers could serve as ale conners and as officers in the lower rungs of local government. And it's likely that the John Morrison who served as a town officer from 1561 was in fact Elspeth's husband. Certainly her second husband, as we'll see, served in this capacity. In 1562, John Morrison was an ale taster, possibly a good way to become acquainted with Elspeth Barnet. Anyway, by 1566, they were married. Now, an important aspect of marriage was the economic partnership between husband and wife. The attack on Janet Sutherland in 1566 took place in what was identified as John Morrison's house. And although it was identified as his, it's likely that the alehouse business was a joint enterprise, with Elspeth providing the ale, and making the ale, serving the customers. And certainly earlier on, we find the couple together jointly purchasing malt. By 1568, perhaps widowed by then, she had the establishment under her own name as another brawl took place there. Now, as we mentioned, running an alehouse was not always smooth sailing. We know about Elspeth's alehouse because of another fight that began there in November 1568. John McIrris and Andrew MacPhail came to blows. It's not clear who started the fight, but John called Andrew a priest's cat or bastard, and Andrew gave him a blow on the cheek. John then chased Andrew through the town and into the outskirts, and according to Andrew, if the town watch had not intervened, he would have slain him. And the court actually found both men guilty. Now, John McIrris had a bit of a dicey reputation. He was accused by another woman of sleeping with none other than Marion Ogilvy, Elspeth's partner in crime, in 1566. He was soon in trouble again in another brawl. But despite this, or maybe even because of this, maybe Marion Ogilvy had reported favorably on him to her friend Elspeth. He had caught Elspeth's eye, and in fact, they were married in 1570, and they settled in a house, probably in the Bridgegate. They acted together in business affairs several times, and they also jointly got into hot water in October 1570 for usurping burgess privileges by illegally dealing in skins. And John promised both on his own and on Elspeth's behalf that this would not happen again. John seems to have behaved himself somewhat more circumspectly after this. In 1572, he was elected an officer of the town, so just like John Morrison. Among his duties was passing through the town, ensuring that people attended preaching in the kirk on Sundays. So he must have had a fairly respectable reputation by then. Control over his own wife's actions was not a sure thing, however, and in December 1574, Elspeth was found guilty of illegally going to the countryside and buying malt before it could be brought to the town to be sold. Now, what about Elspeth's third husband, John McFergus? Well, this is where I have to confess that the Scribal Scots rendering of Gaelic names got the better of me for a while. Although John McIrris originally appears before the court in 1575, in 1576, Elspeth appeared before the court with her husband, John McFergus, to pursue a case. Wow, she remarried fast, I thought, when I first saw this. Until I realized that, in fact, the scribe had begun to represent John's Gaelic last name in a slightly more accurate way. So McIrris is probably John, son of Fergus, or John McFergus. And there were still some slips, but in one document, he actually appears under both names. So in fact, she only married twice, not 3 times as I had originally thought. So far, Elspeth's story has shed light on how women could earn a living and how they worked with their husbands if married. But it's not those aspects of Elspeth's life which brought her to my attention. Instead, it's her somewhat fraught relationship with other inhabitants of Inverness. We've already seen her interaction with Janet Sutherland in 1566, but although she escaped charges this time, she was not usually the innocent party. And we know of several incidents, apart from her brewing, that saw her on the wrong side of the law. A hint of this comes in the 1566 case when Jasper Dempster pointed out that she had in fact been ordered to be banished before. Now, although Elspeth's first appearance in the surviving records is in 1599, she had already amassed quite a reputation. Unfortunately, the records don't survive before 1557, so we can't track them, but a later case mentions that she had been threatened with banishment in 1555, so she was already causing trouble by then. And that might be why her first actual appearance involves discord and violence. In October 1559, she was still a servant of Thomas Vos. A man called Thomas Goy, for some reason, had conceived a violent dislike of Elspeth and gave her serious trouble on a number of occasions. He came to her employer's house where he attacked her, biting her finger and drawing her blood. He also waited in ambush at night at the gate of the house, armed with a stout stick to hit her. Elspeth was also attacked in the house by Ellen Barclay, who insulted her, calling her a common whore and thief, and then struck her with her employer's mask rudder. And this is the implement that you see there, which was used for stirring the malt in the mashing vat. Very useful weapon. It's suggested that Elspeth had been in the middle of brewing at the time of the assault. Elspeth herself was convicted of drawing Thomas Goy's blood, so she was not a passive victim of these attacks. Elspeth appeared before the court again in April 1562. Now, it's not clear what she'd done in this case, but it was enough to bring into force the 1555 threat of banishment if she should misbehave in future. So towns tended to try avoiding banishing people, but they would threaten to do so if you misbehaved. She was declared to have been at fault again, and she was ordered to leave the town within the next month. And if she didn't take advantage of this opportunity to leave quietly, she would be branded on the cheek and then publicly banished. Now, no mention of public banishment follows, so perhaps she did leave of her own accord. However, the town was not free of her for long, as she was back later that year and soon before the court again. Perhaps she felt that her former employer, Thomas Vos, had not done much to protect her in 1559, as by this time she'd fallen out with him as well. Safely away from his employment, and possibly by then married to John Morrison, she launched a blistering verbal attack on him. In January 1563, she was convicted of grievously insulting him, saying, quote, that he would hang himself as his friends did and drown himself as his sister did, and also that, quote, she would have him dead and that she should burn all his corns, his crops, even if she herself should be burnt for it. Now, as Thomas Vos had been chosen as a deacon of the kirk in 1562, this was a serious assault on a respected burgess of the town. Elspeth was suggesting that his sister and friends were guilty of suicide, a terrible sin. Moreover, she asserted that he could not protect his own crops against her, a slur on his authority and on his masculinity. The town took swift action and ordered her banished again, this time forever. If she tried to come back, they said, she would be burnt on the cheek. A public proclamation was to be made at the market cross, so no inhabitant of the town could claim ignorance of her punishment. Moreover, if anyone gave her lodging or received her in the town hereafter, they would be charged as participants in her crimes. But that was not the last that Inverness was to see of Elspeth Barnet. Within 2 years of her permanent banishment, she was back in the town again. And in November 1564, the authorities ordered her banished again, once again threatening to brand her on the cheek if she returned. They hadn't done it this time. It appears that Elspeth had friends in the town who would help her, or who had helped her, because the town ordered again that anyone who received her or helped her would be charged with participating in her offense. And I like to speculate that maybe one of these women was Marion Ogilvy. And yet again, she returned. By April 1566, she was married to John Morrison, and later that year, she participated in the attack on Janet Sutherland that we saw at the beginning of the talk. It's rather surprising, in fact, that she wasn't banished again. Perhaps the authorities had given up on controlling her, or perhaps they hoped that maybe she would live more peaceably now that she was married. And indeed, she did become somewhat more peaceable. But like the good brewster that she was, she continued to break the trade rules, and we can follow her through the 1570s and early 1580s. Like all the other women in the town, although more visible than most, Elspeth Barnet continued to play a vital role in the life of 16th century Inverness. Slàinte and thank you.
Well, thanks for a fascinating talk, Elizabeth. Now, if anyone has any questions, please use the chat function to ask your question. And I think, we already have received a couple of messages. The first is from Kathleen McMorrow, who asks, is an alehouse a pub and or a brewery? And she has had a reply from Leslie Parada, who says, it's a public house where you drink and rent upstairs. So what do you think, Elizabeth?
So an alehouse is defined a little bit informally in this period as a place where you could come and drink ale. So some of them, probably with the women that were the more permanent brewsters, would be running them probably as an inn as well, so that you would in fact have accommodation there as well. It's a little difficult. I think the alehouse that was probably run by John Morrison and Elspeth Barnet might have been one of these. It seems to have been a more permanent thing. The one that was run by Marion Ogilvy's sister may have been one of the more informal ones. So you could basically turn your house into a temporary alehouse by just setting aside a room where you would sell your brewed ale. The other thing that alehouses did was they served a little bit like what we might call an off license now. So it was not uncommon for people to actually bring a container and get the ale and then take it away. And you also get women actually going out in the streets and selling ale in measures in the streets as well. So the alehouse is on the way to becoming what we would think of as a pub, but it's probably a little bit more of an informal arrangement in the 16th century. But it certainly is the precursor of the pub, and we find lots of stories about drinking in pubs and or drinking in alehouses, which fit in very nicely with our stories of drinking in pubs.
The next question is from Robert Reel, and I think he's replying to the image that you had, Elizabeth, the image of the corner and the stick being used for testing the ale, and he says it's called an ale pull, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, that I should say that image is, I was slightly cheating with that because I don't think that's an ale conner that's actually coming to the alehouse. I think it's probably a monk, so I used it mostly for the image of the ale house. But yes, an ale pull would be, which could, where we know of it, I think there's a couple of examples from the 16th century where it was in the form of a branch of a tree, often spruce, because spruce could be used to flavor the ale.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I have another comment from Leslie Parada, who says, that was amazing. Wasn't she a bully?
Yes, relentless, I think, is a term that we would use. Yeah, I do love these women because I mean, it's good for me because the fact that because they have personalities like this, they do show up in the court records, so I can find out about them. I suspect there were several very, more well-behaved women, but unfortunately, they're the ones that we don't learn much about because they don't do anything to show up in the records. But yeah, she was quite a character. You can see her.
I am shocked. I did not know that Inverness went in for all that type of behaviour.
Yes, relentless, I think, is the term that we would use.
And now a comment from Amy. Do you find the term alewife means brewsters or brewers/sellers, or possibly less likely just sellers?
I tend to use it myself for the women that were actually running the alehouses, but you don't find the term alewife that often in the 16th century records. Very occasionally you see it showing up, and they seems to be used for women brewing ale. So it's sort of used interchangeably with brewster. Again, I think it becomes more connected with those women that are actually running these drinking establishments, and that's how I've tended to use it here.
Great. And we also have this comment from David Parkinson, who's out in Saskatchewan.
Hi, David.
So you know each other, do you? Anyway, David says, wonderful, vivid, detailed lecture, Elizabeth. Thank you. Here's the question. Might there be a conventional aspect to brewers' verbal abuse of the borough's ale tasters? Could there even have been a playful quality?
Sorry?
A playful quality. Playful. And David, if you want to unmute yourself and make yourself visible and interject, please feel free to do so.
That's a really interesting question. David and I do a lot on flighting, which is the insults which are thrown at your opponent. There's these what are called flighting contests where you see who can throw the worst insult at one another. And I hadn't really thought about that as a particular insult. I mean, obviously they're throwing whore and thief at each other, but lots of women and men throw that at other women. But that's a really good question. I'm going to thank you, David. That's something I'm going to pursue a little further and have a look. Maybe just look at the women who are doing insults, whether they appear as brewsters or not. So yeah, that's a great other area for me to explore. Thank you so much. David always comes up with the best suggestions. Thank you.
Next, we have a question from iPad, that somebody called iPad. And the question is, how widely was Gaelic spoken at this time in Inverness?
Yeah, great question. So it's not possible to unfortunately all the surviving records are in Scots, which doesn't help, but historians of Inverness reckon that probably 50% or more of the inhabitants would be Gaelic speakers. It's certainly when we have more evidence in the 17th and 18th century, it's still very high. Unfortunately, there aren't the court records are always recorded in Scots. There's one word which has slipped my mind right now, which appears to be a Gaelic insult. I can't quite remember what it is right now, but they seem to. So the courts, when they, I think, especially when they're saying words like whore and thief, they may in fact be translating what the actual Gaelic word was. So the only way we can get at it really is by people's names. And there's a lot of use of patronymics, a typical Gaelic way of naming people. So we get, Donald McBain, McMurtry, McVinnis. We get Effie, Neen, Angus, so Effie, daughter of Angus, and we get both Neen and Nick, and in some cases there are names that are, I think there's one that's got 4 patronymic forms after it, and then of course there's words like Dow, which is almost certainly dew, black. So the Gaelic use of nicknames. So we can what does appear to be the case is that most of the Gaelic named individuals appear to be of the lower social status, so that it appears that either the Burgesses are more likely to be lowlanders, or of course they could also be Gaelic speakers who have changed their name into an English form. So for example, we've got John McFergus here, but there's quite a lot of Fergusons. And I do wonder if, in fact, at one point the Fergusons were McFergus. So it's a little difficult to tell, but I would estimate at least half. But they do seem to, having said that, they appear to have been somewhat bilingual, so that they would understand certainly a lot of Scots, I think. But it was very much, I mean, that's one of the things that makes Inverness so interesting, is because it is most of the Gaelic speaking areas that we have records of were not, they weren't towns. So Inverness is really unusual in that. So it is a way to try and tease out some of the relationships between Gaelic speakers and Scots speakers. Although, as you can see, it also trips me up. I'm attempting to learn Gaelic again for the third time. Thank you, Duolingo. So that's actually beginning to help me get a little bit of a handle on some of these names. The problem is, of course, because you're using patronymics, people might also have, so what's a good example? We've got John Reed Roy Grant. This is probably John Reed Red as a nickname, and then Grant. And sometimes he appears as John Reed, and sometimes he appears as John Reed Roy Grant, and other times he appears as John Roy Grant. And so it can be difficult to disentangle all of these names, but I'm working on it. But Inverness is it. What's nice about Inverness is it's actually one of the few times that we can see Gaelic speakers in urban court records, which are the best. The urban court records survive better than the rural court records for Scotland in the 16th century. So.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Going to the chat again, and we have a comment from William Davidson, who has said, "A very enjoyable lecture." And we have this one again from Robert Riedel, who apparently is out in Germany. And he says, in Germany, a hexagram was used as a signal.
That's really interesting. I wonder sometimes, again, we don't know too much about what type of thing was used, but we do have a reference from another town where one almost wonders if there was a sort of board or some sort of sign on the door, because there's an instance of an ale conner who actually, it says, chalked up the price. So somehow he indicated the price on the door. And the reason we know about that is that as soon as his back was turned, the woman scrubbed it out and put up another price for which she sold the ale. Of course, ended up in court because of that. So it might be some sort of drawing on the door. And that's really interesting about the hexagram. Thank you.
Yes. So Robert has said that in Germany, the symbol used was like David's star. I guess he means the Star of David.
I don't think we know of any. I mean, we wouldn't know what the symbol. I don't know of any reference to what the symbol actually was, but that's really interesting. Thank you for that.
So Elizabeth, here's a question from me. Were all of the court proceedings in Scots or English?
Yeah, Scots. I mean, I know there's a lot of debate about this going on right now in Scotland.
And another question from me. Are you able to read 16th century handwriting?
Yes, I should have actually included an example just to show you how good I am. Yeah, I am. So I can read the original records. As I mentioned, the nice thing about the Inverness records is that in 1899 to 1901, I think it was the town clerk, he decided to make a transcription of the entire, there's 2 volumes surviving for that period, and he made a transcription of the entire 2 volumes. So they're actually available in late 19th, early 20th century handwriting, which is really quite beautiful. And so if you actually go to the archives in Inverness, you can actually ask for the transcripts to be made available. There's 11 volumes of them, so there's roughly 5,500 pages. So it's not a small amount, but they actually are more accessible. And we've had a little bit of discussion about possibly trying to get those digitized and made available, so that people will be able to see them without going to the Highland Archives. I'm still in the process of working on that, but they are absolutely fantastic to read. And to read Scots is not really that difficult. It looks a bit unusual at first, but usually there's a few things to watch out for. But often, if you're a Scots speaker today, you probably will not have that much trouble. If you're not, even if you just say the words out loud, that will often help. So they are, I would say, fairly accessible. Certainly my students in my 3rd and 4th year courses with a little bit of not very much tuition were able to start reading these records. So, and they're fantastic resource. I don't think the only other town that has a complete transcription of its late medieval, early modern records is Aberdeen, and there's a complete transcription now available online of the Aberdeen records from 1398 to 1511. So Inverness is quite unusual. You get a lot of the book that I mentioned, Records of Inverness. You get a lot of 19th century publications of these records, but they're always extracts. So they only give you maybe 10% of what's actually in those volumes. So Inverness is very well served by that. So there's a real treasure there.
Very interesting. Back to the chat again, and the symbol that Robert Riedel mentioned. Okay, he has sent us a link to the symbol, which I have shown here. And Dennis Karen has also sent a link. You can see the subject of his link here. Okay, Elizabeth, so a number of people have left, and in doing so, have left some messages of thanks to you, Elizabeth. One of the questions I had in mind when I saw that picture of the Connors testing the ale, was there a tax on the ale being brewed?
Again, there's not quite a straightforward answer, but yeah. So if you were a burgess, you could brew ale and sell it, and I don't see any evidence that it was taxed. But if you were an unfree, so like not a burgess, you had to pay what was called a stallinger fee or a stallholder's fee, which would give you the license to brew for the year. So you're taxed in the sense that there is a license to do it, which is why they would go after unlicensed ones, because they weren't paying their tax. So they were there's not quite this, taxes are not quite the same in the 16th century. They tend to be imposed for particular reasons. So there's not like an income tax like we would have today. The other form of taxation was if you brought things in from the countryside to sell, you would pay a tax for that. But I think with the brewing, the brewing itself would take place in the town. The barley and possibly also the malt might be brought in from the countryside, and they would have paid a tax at that point. Because we find actually Elspeth going out and buying stuff in the countryside and then sneaking it into the town. There should have been a tax paid on that. So yeah, so it's sort of taxed in an indirect way.
And here's a comment from Kathleen McMorrow. She says, you could illustrate this talk with the tune The Alewife and Her Barrel from the 18th century Caledonian pocket companion created by James Oswald.
Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes, could you send me that reference, Dave?
I will. I will send you that. Hopefully, be able to piece all this together and and get it to you.
That would be brilliant. Thank you for the suggestion. Or did David have one more question? David Parkinson?
If I could just come in.
Yeah. Oh, there he is. Good.
I was thinking about the really interesting discussion that was going on about Gaelic being used in Inverness, and the proportion of Gaelic speakers. So very important to have your insights about that. So I really, really appreciated that dimension. I was beginning to wonder whether you can see the Gaelic idioms actually appearing in the forms of the insults themselves. So it would be fascinating to compare Alewives' angry speech in Inverness with their angry speech in, say, Haddington, or,
That's really, that's really interesting. I have to say, I'm actually, as you know, actually doing a bigger project on this, been on it for rather too long of a time, but my initial impression, but I need to go back and look at it, is that the terms of the words which are being used and what I suppose we might call meter I think it's quite similar to elsewhere, but that is again yet another interesting suggestion for me to explore further. So thank you.
Well, everyone, we have come to the end of the session. However, we have a few comments that we have received via the chat. Dennis Karen says, thanks a lot for an interesting talk. Merci. Leslie Parada says, thank you for a wonderful talk. Robert Riedel says, thank you both for the lovely lecture. And from iPad, which turns out to be John B. McMillan, he has said, thanks, Elizabeth. Good to see you. A very interesting and fun presentation. So, Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us today. I mentioned earlier that you had retired in 2020, but I have to say, I think retirement's too strong a word. I don't see any evidence of retirement here.
The only thing is I don't have to mark papers anymore.
Oh.
By the way, I do actually notice one of the other people who's attending this here is my former colleague, Gil Stelter, who, when I came to Guelph, gave me a baptism of fire by having me give a talk on women in Scotland to the Guelph Men's Club. That might be why I ended up working on masculinity later on. So hello, Gil.
Well, once again, thank you, Elizabeth, for a wonderful presentation. And my thanks to each and every one of you who joined the session today. It was a pleasure to have your company. Thank you for the fascinating questions and for your interest in our projects. Best wishes to you all.